So last week on Monday, I guess, before the break, we started a new unit and we were going over ratios. So since it's been a week since we talked about that, I'm just going to review that lesson that we did last Monday. And after that, we'll let you go. So let me share my screen here. Okay, can somebody tell me when that pops up? Did everybody see that? Yes. Okay. All right. So, like I said, we're talking about ratios and the language that we use when talking about them. So, today, like we did last Monday during our last class, at the end, hopefully, we'll be able to write or say a sentence that describes a ratio. And we'll know how to say words and numbers in the correct order to accurately describe the ratio. So, we looked at this little graphic here and we were thinking about different ways that we could sort these figures and what categories we could use. And then we talked about how many groups of each category that we would have. So if you'll notice, we can separate them into similar items in different ways. So one way we talked about was separating them by color. So we've got four different colors here. We've got a green, we've got yellow, or golden type color. We've got blue or a sky blue. And then we've got white. And instead, we can't put obviously a white color on a white background. So in order to denote the white shapes, I just used a black dot. Then we went through and we counted the number of each different color. And we came up with 5 green, 5 yellow, 5 blue, and then 6 white. So this kind of got us thinking about different ways to sort items and sort figures so we can start talking about them in terms of ratios. So on the next slide, I don't have them with me, but on the video from last class, I had a bunch of shapes here at my house that I showed everybody on the screen. I held them up so everybody could see them. So I had squares, rectangles, and triangles. So we talked about how to sort the collection of shapes that I showed you all. So we determined that there were 2 squares, there was 1 rectangle, and there were 4 triangles. And then we wrote the sentences that we see down here. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about describing a ratio. So the first one says the ratio of one category to another category is blank to blank. So the first one we talked about, the first category we talked about squares. In the second category we talked about triangles. So the ratio of squares to triangles would be 2 to 4 then. Why? Well, we have 2 squares and we have 4 triangles. So whenever we're talking about ratios and we're putting it in a sentence in order to describe those ratios, the first category goes with the first blank. The second category goes with the second blank. So the square category, there are 2 squares, so that the number 2 would go with the first blank. And then the second category was triangles. We have 4 triangles, so 4 would go in the second blank. So the first category goes in the first blank, second category goes in the second blank. So another way to write that would be, again, the ratio of one category to another category is blank to blank. But you notice this time, instead of writing the word to, they used a colon. So it just means the same thing, it's just a different way to write it. It also means to. So the ratio of, we use rectangles and triangles this time. So the ratio of rectangles to triangles is 1 to 4. 1 to 4. but this time we wrote it using a colon instead of writing the word two. So the first category, rectangles, goes with the first blank. We have one rectangle, so that goes in the first blank. The second category is triangle. We have four triangles, so the number 4 goes in the second blank. So first category, first blank, second category, second blank. So again, the ratio of rectangles to triangles is 1 to 4. Now, how do we know that? Well, we have one rectangle and we have 4 triangles. So one other way to write that is there are blank of one category for every blank of another category. So the same thing here. The first category goes in the first blank. Second category goes in the second blank. And in this example, we talked about squares and rectangles. So how many squares do we have? We have 2 squares. How many rectangles do we have? We have 1 rectangle. So the first category is square. So we have 2 squares. So the number 2 goes in the first blank. The second category is rectangles. We have 1 rectangle. So the number 1 goes in the second blank. So there are 2 squares for every 1 rectangle. This next slide, I was going to have you all sort my shapes another way, like as a color or something like that, but it was too difficult the way I had it set up. I've got a document camera now, so from now on, hopefully if I have some physical items here with me, I can show those to you a little better. But so we'll skip this one. But again, another way to sort those shapes would just be to sort them by color because they were all different colors. All right. So then to summarize what we talked about, and again, this is just a quick summary of what we just mentioned. The definition of a ratio is an association between 2 or more quantities. So there are many ways to describe a situation in terms of ratios. So an association between 2 or more quantities. And what that means, like we just talked about, we took shapes and we sorted them or put them into groups based on similar characteristics. And then we counted the number of each of those categories. So the first example we looked at, we sorted them by using color. So we had 5 green, 5 blue, or something like that. So we sorted them because they all were the same color. And then we counted the number of each color. In the second example we talked about, we sorted them based on the shape that they were. So we had squares, rectangles, and triangles. So we put all the squares together, put all the rectangles together, and we put all the triangles together. And then we counted the number of each square, each rectangle, and each triangle. And then we compared them. So how many squares do we have when we compare it to triangles? Well, we had 2 squares for every 4 triangles. Or the ratio of squares to triangles is 2 to 4. So in this example here, you see the green squares and the white circles. The ratio of squares to circles is 6 to 3. Now, how do we know that? Well, we have 6 squares and we have 3 circles. So the first category is squares. Second category is circles. So the first number we use when comparing them has to be 6 because we have 6 squares. And the second number we use has to be 3 because we have 3 circles. So first category, first blank, second category, second blank. So another way to write that is it's the ratio of circles to squares is 3 to 6. So first category was circles, first blank is 3. Second category is squares, second blank is 6. And there are 2 different ways to write that. Remember, we can either write the word 2 or we can use a colon to represent the word 2. So another way, lastly, to talk about this, how we can sort items and categorize them to talk about ratios, is that we can break those down into smaller units or equal groups. So you see the 3 groups at the bottom. You've got 2 squares and 1 circle in each group. So if we're just talking about one of those groups, then we can say that there are 2 squares for every 1 circle. So again, first category, squares. So the first blank would have been 2. Second category is circle. So the second blank would be 1. So in each little group, we've got 2 squares for every 1 circle. Or vice versa, we've got 1 circle for every 2 squares. So the last thing here, I assigned this as an exit slip for you all to work on. I don't have that pulled up in front of me to know whether you completed that or not. But just for example, we could break these down into a collection as well, same way we did with the shapes, either based on shape or based on color. But in this instance, we're using dogs, mice, and cats. So we can break this collection down into the different type of animal if we wanted to talk about ratios. So for instance, if we wanted to talk about the number of dogs to the number of mice, our first category would be dogs. So our first blank would need to be the number of dogs. And we see we've got 6 dogs. So our second category would be mice. So we know that our second blank would need to be the number of mice. And we see that we have 2 mice. So the ratio of dogs to mice in this example would be 6 to 2. And we could do the same thing with any of these animals: dogs to cats, mice to cats, cats to dogs, cats to mice. So let's do one more based on the number of dogs to cats. So we know our first category is dogs. So our first blank has to be the number of dogs. Our second category is cats. So we know that our second blank has to be the number of cats. So the ratio of dogs to cats is 6 to 4. So I hope that makes sense for you all. And that will allow you to do the exit slip if you haven't done it already. Go ahead and do that and get that done, and I'll get it graded for you. But that lesson, that should have been able to clarify that exit slip up for you if you needed some help on that. But if you haven't done it already and you have questions, please feel free to send me a message on Google Classroom or in an email. And that's all we've got for today. Do you all have any questions for me?